And now, members, we have Deputy Pearse Doherty sharing time with Deputy Mairead Farrell.
Today, the government had the opportunity to give people certainty as they face into a winter of rising costs. Certainty about energy costs, certainty on rents, certainty that those on fixed incomes would be shielded from the price rises that they have seen. They had an opportunity to plan for the future and deliver on housing, and on health, and on real climate action, but they haven't done that today, Cancórlia. Time and time again, we've seen ministers come into this Dáil and deliver budgets that promise much, but ultimately deliver little. And ministers opposite have come today and thrown out large numbers, announced tweaks here and there on the edges of the crises our people face. And for many workers and for many families on middle and low incomes, they will see little change in this budget. What workers and families needed was certainty to get through this winter. Low and middle income earners needed additional support. The younger generation, locked out of opportunity, needed assurances that the housing crisis was going to be tackled. Instead, there are too many instances of this government making the wrong choices or deciding on more of the same. Money and tax reliefs that will be swallowed up by inflation and runaway rents before they can make a difference in people's pockets. By refusing to reduce electricity prices and cap them at pre-crisis levels, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens have left households exposed to further price hikes. Renters have been promised a tax credit that is less than the rent increases that they've seen every year, with the amount to be pocketed by their landlords because you have refused to ban further rent increases. So many workers on middle and low incomes have been pushed to the bottom of the pile with an income tax package that leaves them short-changed. Households needed certainty and support this winter, and ambition to build for the future in delivering on housing and on health. Those workers in the squeezed middle, those earning €35,000 or less, who should have been a priority, have been pushed to the side. For many, the hopes that they had for this budget have been disappointed today. And you bhí an rialta cinteart a chóirt a ghaoine, agus iadin a chóirtear an ggéir chéime an bhfuil costa sí a gairdú. Bhí acu planal don tauchaí hon tíocht sláinte agus gríomh ar son na héraide a chur ar fáil, ach ní seo déanta acu. I gás go leor ibranaí agus teaghlaí a tá ar bhean income agus ar incomíisiil is big éithre icar sa chéanais na seo agus béisiad níos measa as an bhíon seo thugainn. Bhí cinteart ag tastal wifa ón glúneog a tá conithe más deisina go róthar ag dul an leiclis an ggéir cim tíochta ach go leor chesanna bé lag bhisna ar teaghlaí do bhhair an chéanais an leiniu. I can't call you, over the past number of years, our economy and our society have been lurched from one crisis to another. From the uncertainty of Brexit to the global pandemic to a surge in energy prices fuelled by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And throughout these crises, our people have had to contend with persistent failures in housing and in healthcare provision. Despite uncertainty in the global economy, the public finances are in a strong position to support households and businesses in the time ahead. Yesterday, we learned that consumer confidence had fallen to its lowest levels on record, with 1 in 3 households just managing to make ends meet. And everything is going in the wrong direction. Inflation going up, house prices going up, rents going up, interest rates going up. Workers and families face the worst cost of living crisis in a generation and the biggest fall in living standards since the financial crash. Ta imní teach de ribranaí agus teaghlaí faoin ggéir céim costas moralta is massa le tomul fada agus an titim is mó ar chaid an moralta ó Harla and chimpiste airgeadis. This cost of living crisis isn't new, but has been with us for some time. Already having to contend with unaffordable housing and childcare costs, low pay and long hospital waiting lists as a result of government's persistent policy failures, households have now been hit with massive hikes in their energy bills. They have faced these challenges since last year, and for the past year this government refused to listen and refused to act, with this government providing the weakest and least support to households and businesses of any government in Europe. That is the record of this government, with workers and families having to get through a tough year, trying to run the house, trying to provide for families and keep their heads above water. So it is clear that this is a catch-up budget to make up for government inaction over the past year. All the while, Sinn Féin have been consistent throughout this time. We have told government now was not the time for business as usual. We told the government that urgent intervention was needed in the summer months and before to give households certainty and support. I welcome a number of today's announcements. Particularly, student fees will be reduced by €1,000. It will be welcomed by many students and families. But this should be a stepping stone on the path to abolishing student fees. But instead, what are we to see? The student fees will again rise next year, going back to €2,500. A Sinn Féin government would have made the €1,000 reduction permanent and built on it year on year until student fees were ended for all. I welcome today's announcement that tax reductions on petrol, diesel, electricity and gas are to be extended. But these taxes, as you know, Minister, could have been cut further, providing additional relief to households. And tonight we will table amendments calling on further reductions for tax in petrol and diesel, and I hope deputies opposite will support them. The decision once again to leave households using home heating oil, which are a third of people right across the state who use this form of oil to heat their homes. The decision to leave them out of the cold by not only refusing to reduce the tax applied to it, but by deciding to increase it next year with a further carbon tax hike is simply unacceptable. Again, we will table amendments to end this practice and cut the cost for those families and homes. At a time of crisis when energy prices are soaring, a further hike in carbon tax in this area is the wrong direction. It is clear that the government doesn't understand the scale of the cost of living crisis that households face this winter, with a package announced today that fails to provide the certainty and adequate help to help workers and families. A large increase in energy bills is always difficult for households to bear, but an explosion in energy prices will be simply unimaginable for so many households this winter. Over the past year, energy suppliers have announced more than 35 price increases, with scandalous hikes in standing charges, regardless of how much energy a household uses. With all of the price hikes since the beginning of last year, households would now be paying more than €3,000 in their gas and electricity bills each year. For so many, the cost of this is simply not acceptable. They can't bear it. It means arrears, it means destitution, it means the inability to run their homes this winter. The surge in energy prices, which has been turbocharged by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But we also can't ignore the government's failures that have led to a price shock now facing households, and the public do deserve the truth. On the wholesale energy market, we know that it is a market that is broken, with electricity generators making windfall revenues and profits on the back of a surge in gas prices, even if they don't use gas. That is how our broken energy market operates. For the past year, Sinn Féin and indeed governments in Europe have called for this broken market to be reformed. For the past year, this government has opposed its reform, pushing up energy prices for households and securing windfall profits for energy companies. Sinn Féin and others have called for taxes to be levied against these windfall profits in the face of government opposition. These are the facts, and I welcome the U-turn by the Minister for Finance today to say that he will introduce a windfall tax, because he argued against this here in the Dáil just a number of months ago. This failure to get to grip with the energy crisis has swollen the coffers of energy companies and drained the bank accounts of struggling households. A Sinn Féin government would have acted differently. We would have stopped the excess profits that energy companies are making as a result of government inaction, and we would have given households certainty and support by cutting electricity prices back to their pre-crisis levels and keeping them there right throughout the winter months. And we would have delivered cost of living cash payments to middle and low-income earners to support them with other rising energy costs. Now, this government took a different approach. Today, the government has announced electricity credits to every home, and no doubt this measure will be welcomed by many. On the surface, that's completely understandable. But if we dig deeper, we see that it is the wrong approach. This subsidy to households will do nothing to stop further price hikes in the coming weeks and months ahead, and will support the profit margins of energy companies. So there is a better way, and Sinn Féin would have reduced electricity prices, we would have capped them at pre-crisis level, and we would have given certainty to those families and households through the winter months, ensuring that all households receive fair support and certainty in the time ahead based on the energy that they use. Now, this measure, Concordia, if you want to inform the government backbenchers who are heckling, this measure is an option under the European Commission's energy toolbox and has been since March of this year. It is a measure that provides households with certainty and support they so desperately needed. And that is precisely why other countries throughout Europe have implemented it, from Austria to France, from Poland to Netherlands, because it was the right choice, a better choice, but one that this government has failed to take and have left those households vulnerable to these energy companies. I can call you the cost of living crisis is hitting people hard, particularly working people. Their incomes were squeezed before this crisis, with rents, with childcare fees, with back-to-school costs, with price rises eaten into more of their pay packets every year under this government. They were working hard for themselves and their families, but they feel that the state is not working for them, and they needed more money in their pockets just to stand still and to get by. Tan Geirchin costas moralta idol avem gojian aribadani. Vi gojin come for Brussels, Hetzen Geirkim Shohama, le Kais, le Teli Kurumyani, le Costas y Filu Rash the Scala, Agazerdi air Pricena, Ectar Erinch ni Smo, Gis ni Smo, a good poya Gafflian, Queen Realta Shaw. At times of inflation, a pay increase that fails to rise with the rate of inflation is a real terms pay cut. And that is precisely what the government has handed out to our lowest paid workers on the minimum wage. Those workers who kept our economy and society function during the pandemic. I'm talking about the cleaners, the workers on the shop floor, and the many, many others who are currently on the minimum wage. Instead of getting a pay rise, the government have handed them what is really, in effect, given inflation, a pay cut. Under the government's 80-cent increase to the minimum wage, these workers will be worse off next year than they were last year. A minimum wage increase of more than €1 would have been needed just to protect the spending power of these workers, protect them from inflation and the impact of price rises. And that's why Sinn Féin would have increased the minimum wage by €1.40, boosting the take-home pay of workers up to €2,150. Working people who have spent nights wondering how they will make ends meet were hoping for a budget that paid attention to them, supported them and treated them fairly. And the income tax package announced today didn't do that and left many of them out of the cold. The income tax package that the Minister for Finance announced will benefit someone on €135,000 to the tune of €830, while three-quarters of earners will actually only benefit by €190. So what message does that send out to people who are in the squeezed middle, whether you're a staff nurse working on our hospitals at this point in time, or a teacher or somebody in the private sector earning €35,000, that somebody on €135,000 is going to get a tax break at least 4 times more than what you're going to get? It tells them, that they're an afterthought, and means that their take-home pay will get them less next year than what it did last year. This is an income tax package that gave these working people the cold shoulder. Sinn Féin would have had different priorities. We made it clear that there was different choices, and we would have delivered a different tax package that was fair. And that could have been done by cutting the USC, ensuring that we put the money into the pockets of middle and low-income earners, and made sure that people on over 100,000 weren't benefiting more than 4 times what people on the squeezed middle were benefiting from. This, along with their cost of living payments, would have put up to €700 into the pockets of that nurse, of that teacher, or of that factory floor worker earning €35,000. Will USC get it Sinn Féin agus icotí costas moralta tucha again de brinny ban income agus income níisiil hon tacu lá. Ag chur €700 a bóci an Altrafornia and Munchar na Nibri at ag sirú €3,500 in aina bianna. Real support, real relief, but the government took a different approach, one, in my view, that is the wrong one. The cost of living crisis, as I said, is not new. Runaway rents have been a feature of the rental sector for many years, with renters being fleeced by landlords and pushed to breaking points by government's failure over the past decade. The average rent is now €2,800 more per year than it was when this government took office. And Dublin is even worse, Rents are 3,600 more than when this government took office. And no matter how you dress it up, no matter how you dice and splice this, you cannot avoid the fact that the government's housing crisis is crushing the living standards of renters, it's cutting their disposable income, and it's harming their ability to save for the future. While Sinn Féin have been calling for rents to be reduced and frozen, the government allowed them to spiral out of control. For years now, Sinn Féin have been calling for a month's rent to be put back into renters' pockets and a ban on rent increase. Year after year, this government have voted against this and refused to cut rents, refused to support renters. And what the government have announced today is a pure and pale imitation of the action Sinn Féin have been calling for. So the government have announced a tax credit for renters of €500. But in my own county, Corlia and Donegal, the average rent has increased by €1,400 in the past year alone. Not only does this tax credit fail to cover the cost of rent increases in the past year, the reality is that landlords will pocket this with further rent hikes in the years ahead. A tax credit for renters can only work when you ban rent increases, and this government has failed to do it. That is why Sinn Féin have called for 1 month's rent back into renters' pockets, together with a ban on rent increase, so that the benefit goes to the renter minister and not to the landlord. But you know this, and so does the Taoiseach. And how do I know it? Because this is exactly what you said. You said in February here in the Dáil that a measure such as this would be a transfer of exchequer funding directly to landlords, and that is what you announced. You said it would not reduce the pressure on tenants, and you were right, because you had to ban rent increases also. And sure, the Taoiseach doubled down on it in Leaders' Questions earlier this year. He said, in response to Mary Lane MacDonald, calling for a renter's tax credit and a ban on rent, he said that a measure would only add to the price of rents. He said that it would be inflationary. He said there was no guarantee that it would be wouldn't be taken up by landlords. He said no guarantee whatsoever. So today you have announced a measure that you know in your heart and heart, indeed you told us all here in the Dáil, that this will be pocketed by landlords at a time when tenants are so desperate, when renters are so desperate for real relief that will make a real difference for them. What we needed to see from a government today was a ban on rent increase and for their rents to come down. Today, once again, the government refused to give them certainty to those renters and to ban rent increase. So instead, what we have is a measure that the government themselves told us that will push up rents and go into the pocket of landlords. The Minister himself said that this type of tax credit that he just announced earlier on would not benefit, and I quote, low-income workers and students, tens of thousands of whom are struggling in the rental sector. So it also won't be lost on all of these people who won't benefit from this that the government today has announced the increase in eligible expenditure of tax relief for landlords 10 times the amount of the tax credit that they're trying to pretend that renters will benefit from. A Sinn Féin government would have done things differently. We would have given certainty and we would have given real relief to renters, putting 1 month's rent up to €1,500 back into their pockets and banning rent increases, making sure that the runaway rents that we've seen under this government has come to an end. A younger generation has been locked out of the opportunity of home ownership. They've been faced with crippling rents and unaffordable prices. Under this government, house prices have broken through the Celtic Tiger peak, with the average house price now across the state standing at more than €310,000. That would require an income of €80,000 just to qualify for a mortgage. The government's housing policy has failed, with rates of home ownership collapsing for younger generations while developers' profits soar. Sinn Féin is the party of home ownership. This government is the government of speculators and developers. And despite all of the evidence, this budget is silent on the scandal of investment funds outbidding and outpricing struggling home buyers. There will be champagne corks flying tonight with institutional investors because the red carpet is going to be continued to roll out by this government. They pay no tax on their rental income, no CGT tax on on asset disposals, because this government is firmly wedded to a policy that allows them to push up house prices on ordinary families and to outbid them same families for desperately needed homes. That's what's happening, snapping up new builds and second-hand homes from under the noses of people so desperate to try and get a home. And this is government policy. You've gifted them with tax advantage. As I said, no corporation tax, no capital gains tax on the disposal of assets, with light touch regulations easily sidestepped. Those working and saving to buy a home for their first home have the cards all stacked against them, Minister, and you're the guy who stacked those cards against them. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael created this housing crisis, and your policies are making it worse. The delivery of social and affordable homes continues to fall short of the demand as targets continue to be missed. Despite the unavoidable reality which renters and struggling homeowners or home buyers face every day, today's budget shows no departure from the past. It is clear that the government have locked themselves and, unfortunately, our people into the same failed housing strategy. This budget needed to be ambitious. It needed to provide funding for 20,000 public homes. However, the combined increase announced today for real social and affordable homes is only €68 million. That's less than the €98 million that you're planning of additional money to spend on long-term leasing for social housing, which is more expensive for the taxpayer and less secure for tenants. Ending the scourge of vacant and derelict properties and putting them back into use to rent and buy is crucial to address the housing crisis. So, in that context, I do want to welcome the fact that you have belatedly brought forward an announcement in relation to a vacant property tax. It's long overdue. It's something that we in Sinn Féin have been calling for several years. But it will only deliver and penalise vacancy and put properties back into use if it is punitive. So while we welcome this, we want to see the detail in relation to how this will be implemented. I also want to welcome the defective concrete box project levy announced today, and it is clear that the government hasn't provided enough to fund this scheme. That will deliver from homeowners. I think it's about €6 million or something additional that you've provided. Like, come to Donegal, listen to the houses. We talk about an energy crisis and trying to heat your home. Think of trying to heat your home when you can actually see the curtains flapping with the wind breezing through them. What we needed was a proper package. Sinn Féin would have put €140 million here. The government has fallen way short in relation to this. Inflation and rising prices impact everybody, but as we know, it doesn't impact everybody equally, with those in lower and fixed income hit the hardest. And one of the most shameful aspects of the government's inaction over the past year was the refusal to support those in low incomes who had to make choices that no one should have to make. We've seen families join the queues for food banks that they once made donations to, with parents and pensioners having to choose between turning the heating off and putting less food on the table. And for the past year, you've allowed them to wither on the vine. It's clear that the government don't get the enormous financial pressure that has been heaped on these individuals. The €12 increase in social welfare announced today will not commence until January, and it is far outstripped by the rate of inflation and price rises. That means that these households will have less to get by on next year than they did last year. Less to get by on despite soaring energy bills and higher food prices. So you have consciously decided, Minister, and I can't understand this for the life of me, why the both of you have decided consciously to do this, but you've decided that some of our most vulnerable citizens will be poorer next year than they were last year. And for them, this is not a caring budget, but a careless budget, pushing these households into greater hardship, making it harder for them to meet the bills or to put food on the table. Sinn Féin knows that it's not possible to protect everyone from every single price increases. But protecting the most vulnerable from poverty must be the first test of any real republic, and this government has failed that test. While Sinn Féin welcomes today's announcement of supports of various social welfare recipients in the form of lump sum payments, our favoured approach, as we outlined to you in our cost of living package proposed for this year, was combined cash payment, weekly increases in social welfare rates effective from October, and interventions to prevent electricity prices and rents from rising further. Our approach would have offered greater certainty and security to those most financially vulnerable citizens, including pensioners, people with disabilities and carers that badly need that certainty. And this can't dress up the fact that the government have failed to protect fixed incomes from rising prices and inflation. You've left those vulnerable households more exposed and worse off. As a result of inflation, those individuals with fixed incomes now will be over €800 worse off next year than they were last year. A Sinn Féin government would have acted differently. We would have increased working age social welfare rates and pension payments for those living alone by €17.50, and we would increase disability-related payments by €20. That's what was required, Minister, to shield them from the cost of living crisis at a time when they need most help. But that hasn't happened today. And with the increases in social welfare and pension rates falling well below inflation, then we see again the wrong priorities, the wrong decision that will be felt in the pockets of our most vulnerable. Minister, this government has weakened the foundations of our health service. It's driven by a failure in planning, in shortcuts in investment, in unequal access to health service, and the results are clear for everyone to see. Our health service is understaffed, it's under pressure, and with staff very close to burnout. More than 5 years on from Childcare report, and this government is still yet to agree a public-only consultant contract to resolve long-standing disputes with staff from junior doctors to medical scientists. And the waiting lists continue to spiral out of control. The numbers speak for themselves. 31,000 people is the number of patients on waiting list this year, with 900,000 waiting for an appointment, 100,000 of those children. Yet what do we see from government's response? There's no additional funding to deliver more hospital beds. There's only £4 million for acute service, and your only solution really is to fund a one-off private sector outsourcing. Across primary care, youth mental services and disability service, we have 210,000 people on waiting lists. There are 20,000 children with disabilities still waiting for an initial contact, Minister, with a disability network team, never mind the follow-up therapy and intervention. They're waiting for speech and language therapy, they're waiting for counselling, psychology support, basic services that they're entitled to, basic services that are essential to give them a fair chance, an equal chance to their peers. But this budget is a complete failure to these people with disabilities and their families. It falls so short of what is needed by about 80%. Mental health is clearly not a priority for either of you or for this government, with only 14 million extra in new funding and at least 80 million when 80 million was needed, according to reports. Children with scoliosis, with spina bifida, are let down time and time again, while at the same time hearing from yourselves that they are the priority, that they and their parents are let down by the action and broken promises of government, and that has happened again today. This budget was an opportunity for the government to build for the future. It was an opportunity to tackle future hospital waiting lists. It was an opportunity to recruit and retrain healthcare staff that was badly needed and provide a safe and health service. But the government wasted that opportunity today. Today you announced that 340,000 people will get free GP visit cards next April. Big promises, there to be welcome, but without planning and delivery, there will be broken promises. Because we've been here before, and you know that. 3 years ago, the government legislated for free GP care for all children up to 12, but they didn't deliver it. In last year's budget, Minister Donnelly announced free GP care would be given to 6- and 7-year-olds. I think Deputy McGrath actually announced that in his speech last year, 1 year later, and none of these children have received it. So today we have another big announcement, another big promise, and a vague commitment to additional supports for GPs. But there's been no discussion with GPs, no clarity in relation to the additional supports which might be, and you've lumped this package in with other measures, making it clear that there's no real plan to support the expansion of eligibility. But what people need isn't promises or soundbites, they need delivery. They need a plan, they need investment, and a lesson that this government should have learned from the recent debacle around the school transport. The energy price shock has led to high and unsustainable energy costs for so many businesses and farms across the state. Businesses that support jobs and employment, farms that are the bedrock of a rural community and our economy. Sinn Féin proposed a scheme that would provide state support to cover a portion of these businesses' energy bill to protect their viability and the jobs that they support. So I welcome the measures that have been announced today to provide support for businesses and farms, but we must ensure that these supports are targeted where it is needed. During the pandemic, we saw how large businesses received taxpayers' money while paying dividends to shareholders. This can't be allowed to happen again, and we look forward to details of the scheme that have been announced today. Minister, time is getting the better of me, so I just want to conclude with the fact that we do know that workers and families are in the grip of the worst cost of living crisis in a generation. They've seen their prices rises beyond what their pay packets can bear, and many of them are genuinely feared how they will get through the winter. Today, the government had an opportunity to give those families certainty, to give those support, to give them assurances that they would be able to manage. Well, there are measures that are announced in today's budget that we in Sinn Féin welcome, and indeed many measures that we've been calling on you to do for many years and quite a while. I'm afraid that the government missed this opportunity. I think that you had the wrong priorities in a number of areas and made the wrong choices. The government made a choice not to give household price certainty this winter by reducing electricity prices to their pre-crisis levels and keeping them at that point. You made a choice not to protect the most vulnerable from the impact of inflation, leaving them worse off next year than they were last year. And you made a choice to forget the squeezed middle in your unfair income tax package. Minister, these were the wrong choices. Before today, our people face crises in housing and in health. Runaway rents and unaffordable house prices, over 900,000 people on hospital waiting lists, our emergency departments overflowing with capacity, our healthcare staff facing burnout. And unfortunately, when we pare back all of the numbers and all of the big announcements that have been announced today, for many of these crises will persist this winter and next. Indeed, for many it will worsen. A Sinn Féin government would have had different priorities and make better choices, because the true test of this budget is whether the most vulnerable households will be better off or worse this winter compared to next year, whether it would have planned for the future and delivered improvements in health service and tackled the housing crisis. But unfortunately, Minister, for far too many, I believe this budget has failed that test.
Politics is about choices. Budgets are about choices. Indeed, a budget literally reflects the different political choices and the different priorities of the government of the day. So when people my age say to me that there's nothing for them here, that there's no chance of us ever owning our own home, or I'm not sure what to do about starting a family because I just can't afford to, it's because of the political choices that you have made over years, and it is because of the political choices you have made today. But the reality is that this budget was never written with our young people in mind. It was written by a government that is out of touch, and it shows. This is certainly no budget for young people and young families. We see no meaningful action to solve the housing crisis, no meaningful action on climate, too little on childcare. This is a budget that says to our young people that once again you are being brought up for export, the mantra of successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments. The Taoiseach used to speak about creating a republic of opportunity. Remarkable then that many people now see this as an opportune moment to emigrate. But it was never written to keep our young people from emigrating or to give those who have left the opportunity to come home. In some parts of today's presentation, Ara, it would appear that you've spent the weekend rummaging through our wardrobe, stealing our clothes, but unfortunately, rather than a fashion upgrade, it appears to be something of a wardrobe malfunction. The outfit you've chosen doesn't match, you've got your shoes on the wrong feet, and some of our proposals that you have borrowed I welcome, but unfortunately, in some instances, you have weakened them or watered them down or simply made them unworkable. We do acknowledge, Ara, that in recent times the world has suffered several shocks: COVID, inflation, an energy crisis and, of course, war. Individually, each of these have been highly significant. Cumulatively, they have been even more so. But we have a cost of living crisis which long predates these shocks. Many will watch on today to see what decisive action you have taken on affordable housing, stopping rent increases and real delivery on childcare costs. Taxation and expenditure and the fashion in which they are deployed help to test whether the government's obligations to its citizens are met. These can be new measures used to tackle a new crisis, like the energy crisis that families are facing, or they can be long-standing proposals. Many of the best proposals to tackle the more long-standing problems we face have rarely been given a chance, because they are opposed by certain special interests who benefit from the status quo that your government has created, which have created the crisis that we now face in housing and in healthcare. A Sinn Féin government would today offer help in the short term to deal with a freezing winter. We'd offer certainty in the medium term and hope in the long term that not only could things be better, but indeed that they would be better. Bhí deis ar le ag an rialtas inniu cínseacht de thuirt go haidhí agus go gnólachtaí. Sin a bhí ag tastal inniu, cínseacht de Jeremy Laidú ar bhilí electrachas, cínseacht a díobh Price Císa agus cínseacht a díobh tíocht ina chuoine. Bhí 5 óhór an leis an gosas marachtáil a fiú rih an gogus an Ucrain. Marall ar chustas sí orda cuaramlánaí agus chustas sí orda tíochta. Agus méid breanú ar an gána snéis inniu, tá méid breanú ar céir atá dhéine leis na costaisí sin a laidú agus ní eice mór an cínseacht ar sin. Tá se go maith gur éis sibh linn i dtíobh airgid a chur arásca i bócaí císóirí ach mar dúirt sibh féin muna dagan se sin le bach ar ordú ar Price Císa ar feadh 3 bliana tá buíoch an go gcuirfí sé seo le Price Císa mar a churann an scéim cabhair le ceannacht le Price tíochta rud atá á leanann semach agaí ar feadh 2 bliain eile. Tá sé bheith cantir laidú de 5 fin géad ar chostas cuaramlánaí agus beidir go cinna má a bháin sinna dhéana rih an bailscú ach anis ní leor é. Fecinn an pobal blian in ní blian na geallann a dhéanaan rialtas de chodína fáil agus ina gael dómh ar lá na gáin aisnéise. Ach is minic nach bhecinn siad tura ar na geallann sin, mar nach richter na spricne a leachtar amach baile feicil a ara, baile feicil. Ara, see the cost of living crisis that families and businesses are facing this winter. This should be priority number 1. Not only should it be priority number 1 now, it should have been for months. And that priority should be around certainty around energy prices. Crucially, we would provide a cap on the price of electricity. This is needed urgently to provide the kind of certainty that households require. And it is the kind of certainty that other households in EU countries will be receiving. This would return electricity prices back to their summer 2021 costs. And importantly, we would also bring in a windfall tax, and we must decouple gas from electricity prices, something we have long been calling for, but it is something that this government, in its infinite wisdom, opposed last year. You've decided to go down the energy credit route. This won't work. The credit provided could quickly be overtaken by price increases. Then hard-pressed families will still be left worrying. They could still be left with an awful choice of having to decide whether to put food on their table or to keep the lights on. And this is why our proposal creates greater certainty. And this is why we have proposed an emergency cost of living crisis package, a package that recognises the scale of this crisis. And this would also include emergency one-off cash payments to middle and low-income households. And this is the kind of certainty that households need, whereby they know exactly what they will be liable for this winter and can plan accordingly. Ara, as you're aware, we've had a long waited for a real and fundamental change to the cost of childcare, and it is now widely accepted that the cost of childcare really is the equivalent of a second mortgage. And we know this because families literally tell us this. And I know that in Galway, young couples tell me that they're paying as high as €50 a day for childcare services. And in Dublin, we know that the average monthly fee is €810. But I have to say, your proposals won't exactly wow young couples. It pales in comparison to our own proposal to reduce fees by 2/3. This would bring that average fee that I mentioned to €270. Your proposal only reduces them by a quarter. If you had enacted your proposal before the current bout of inflation, it might have been seen as a welcome step, but in the current environment it's just nowhere near enough. And it also won't be a major incentive for those young people who are considering emigrating, who have been putting off starting a family because of the high cost. Your measure won't stop childcare being a second mortgage. You've just slightly reduced the cost of the second mortgage, but a second mortgage is still a second mortgage. For those parents who have young adults leaving for college for the first time and have had to pay the student contribution charge, which is essentially obviously fees and by another name, you have made a €1,000 reduction this year, as we have, and this must be the first step towards eliminating fees. We need to work towards genuinely free third-level education. But next year, people will find their fees going back up. And Ari, you will have heard of the students who have had to defer their dream course because they can't find accommodation. And a third of those who deferred their course in NUI Galway this year did so because they couldn't find a place to live. And I worry that that accommodation situation is unlikely to get better next year. Indeed, I am concerned that it would get worse. And we hear their stories. We hear student stories. One student from Offaly said, "I have commuted up to 6 hours a day to reach UCD from Offaly. I know lads travelling from Longford daily. I am weary. I am in final year, but I cannot face it. I'm deferring." Students will be camping out in Ayr Square tomorrow evening to highlight this crisis. I will be joining them, and they need delivery on housing. We see €12 increase in core social welfare rates. That's inadequate and adds little to an already inadequate social protection scheme. €12 doesn't protect from inflation. It doesn't even come close. It doesn't protect them from poverty and doesn't recognise the impact of the cost of living crisis on those reliant on fixed incomes. The fact that these increases will not be introduced until January, I have to say, beggars belief. I didn't believe it when I saw it until I heard you say it here today. Instead, carers, people with a disability, lone parents, older people will wait for weekly increases for another 4 months. These are the households who are already living in poverty and making choices between putting food on the table and turning on the lights. Yet the message is your weekly fixed income won't change until January, despite them currently living in a frighteningly fluid situation. And this is why we called for €15 increases immediately, rising to €17.50 next year for working age payments and pensioners living alone, and €20 for weekly disability payments. Some things every year stand out, I suppose, from budgets. And last year, I'll never forget sitting here last year listening to the two Ari in front of me announcing measure after measure, then only to realise you had once again forgotten the renters of this country. There wasn't a mention of them. Renters were left absolutely baffled and astonished that the government had no action to alleviate the huge pressure they were under. Indeed, your initial proposal for renters, and I have to say I will actually never forget this one, was that you had decided to link rents to the rate of inflation, which was obviously a very bright idea at the time. But thankfully, due to the fact that most people saw that this was nonsensical, there was a U-turn on that one. And imagine where renters would be now if that had happened. But for them, Ministers, this cost of living crisis was well underway this time last year. We already had some of the highest rents in Europe, but all of that was ignored. Renters need certainty, and that is what Sinn Féin would bring them. We would cap and reduce rents. We would put 1 month's rent back in renters' pockets, and we would ban rent increases for 3 years. And it does seem that you've finally seen the light on this one and sought to introduce this measure, which we've been proposing for several years. But unfortunately, in this government's characteristic style, you have failed to grasp how this measure should be implemented, although you did point it out to us when we talked about it. And you haven't taken the appropriate steps to ensure that it will not be inflationary. You've taken a solid Sinn Féin proposal, but then watered it down. Your renters' credit might have been a month's rent a decade ago, just to be clear, but it's not even a fortnight's rent for many people. And maybe that's your problem. You don't actually know what people are going through in the here and now. And the glaring omission in all of this is the failure to instigate a ban on rent increases, as we have been calling for. Introducing a credit without a cap will be inflationary. It will cause rents to rise, as you told us. You even recognised it. And your failure to ban rent increases means that no sooner will this money enter the pockets of renters than it will have gone back out and into the pockets of landlords. And how could you get it so wrong? But I suppose it shouldn't be a surprise. You've been getting it wrong for years. To be specific, you've been getting it wrong on housing for years. And what our President Michael D. Higgins aptly described as a great failure, but to be more precise again, it is your great failure. Although maybe it has been your great achievement. I mean, it must be actually listed as an achievement that in just over a decade you managed to push house prices back above Celtic Tiger levels. They do always say that it always seems impossible until it's done, but my God, have you done it. We already had the highest property prices in the EU, and you're hell-bent on keeping it that way. This has locked so many out of home ownership, trapped in a rental cycle where rents consume more, and on occasion much more than a third of people's income. After they've covered all their other expenses, there's little left to save for a deposit. Compounding this problem is that rents keep on rising. The cost of renting in Ireland rose 76.7% between 2010 and 2022. So people are forced to chase a moving target. And while people are running, trying to keep up with rents, a speed bump of any size can throw them off that track and result in homelessness. Ministers, honestly, And you have to know it yourselves, the housing situation is getting worse. You have to hear it in your clinics, you have to be stopped in the streets, and from your offices trying to help families on the brink of homeless, with the answer continuously coming back that nothing can be done. And it came as a surprise to us all when earlier this year the Taoiseach said maybe it was time for Fine Gael had another go at housing. Like, seriously, what more damage could you actually do? But we know what Fine Gael does when it comes to housing. Whereas Fianna Fáil follow the dreams of the developers, Fine Gael follow the dreams of the investment funds, and that's who's been the inspiration for your housing policies. It was bad enough that these funds were buying up so much of the stock of new homes, but now we're learning that they are buying up huge amounts of second-hand properties. On Sunday, the Business Post revealed that institutional investors and real estate firms spent around $1 billion buying second-hand homes last year. This equated to around 4,500 properties in a section of the market typically targeted by first-time buyers. Then again this week we saw the Ditch reveal that a fund backed by the Singaporean government spent $300 million since 2019, and they have bought over 850 second-hand homes. As bad as the housing situation is, this is just another indication that it is set to get worse still. Second-hand homes can be cheaper than new builds. They're often the only way most first-time buyers can enter home ownership. But once again, it seems that the investment funds are closing off that avenue too. Last year, Taoiseach, you said the levy on investment funds would mean the entities could not compete with first-time buyers. We told you that the levy you were introducing on the bulk purchase of new homes wasn't enough. We told you the exemptions in apartment blocks would make it unworkable, but again you dismissed us. It was mere populism on our part, of course. But once again we see that not only are they still bulk buying new homes, but now they're making large purchases of second-hand homes too. So we've heard about landlords fleeing the market, and we're seeing the smaller landlords are fleeing, and this is the accidental landlords who had buy-to-lets that were previously in negative equity that they are leaving. But who is stepping into their place? The investment funds. I mean, for God's sake. How bad will it have to get before you realise that these investment funds are a blight on our society? And then we see Housing for All. And this is the big plan for supply, supply, supply. The targets for the delivery of social and affordable homes were seriously lacking in ambition to begin with, but even those lowly targets keep being missed, and I can bring you to Galway to show you that. There's more giveaway. Then let us recall the recent census figures of thousands of vacant homes in this state. And Ara, we hear that you're bringing in to introduce a vacant property tax, so cheers to that. But the time to have done this was long ago. When it comes to housing, the choice is clear. Do we want a housing system where a house is a home, somewhere to raise your young children in, somewhere to grow old, somewhere to make fond memories, or do we want our housing system to be an asset class, filled with odd-sounding acronyms for different investment vehicles, which I'll list and get wrong, IREFs, ICAVs, KIFs, CCFs? You've committed to review some of these, but what's there to review? I could go on, but you get the picture. The choice is clear: housing based on human need, or financial asset class based on speculative greed. Then when it comes to our health system, the sad reality is that it is neither healthy nor a system. In some ways, it mirrors the housing crisis. Both are a failure in planning and failed ideology, which has damaged public services. It is not working for those who need it. Waiting lists continue to grow, while people wait in their thousands for medical care. The trolley crisis continues to get worse, and again on Friday there were 69 people on trolleys in Galway University Hospital, something that we honestly thought wouldn't happen again post-COVID. And it's also not working for the hard-pressed healthcare professionals toiling night and day trying to keep the show on the road. And that is why Sinn Féin would deliver an Irish National Health Service over the space of 10 years. We would place dignity, respect and fairness at the heart of healthcare and labour relations. And we're not in the business of making promises that we can't keep. And we see that you've only spent an additional €20 million on disability, whereas we provided €152 million, and that is appalling. You've outlined just an additional €14 million for mental health, and that is shocking. We provided €81 million because that is what is needed. As I said, we don't make promises that we can't keep, and any of our measures that we have announced are based on realistic, deliverable targets. We've seen on multiple occasions in the past the government make health-related announcements which are not delivered. Your GP announcement sounds good, but the GPs woke up this morning and this was news to them, and we all heard the GP on the radio this morning, and he had said that he had no idea how they will cope if your proposed measure goes ahead. And I really hope this isn't the government looking for praise in the absence of proper preparation, because we remember the promise to deliver GP care to all children up to 12 that was legislated for 3 years ago, and this never happened. Big announcements without the planning is doomed to fail. We saw it before on staffing and beds. In Budget 2021 and in last year's winter plan, just over 1,200 beds were provided for. A quarter of these are funded but not yet delivered. The Minister couldn't deliver what he funded because there isn't a plan. The increase you've announced today for acute services is less than 0.1% increase for our hospital. The figure is so low, it's left me wondering whether it's true. Not a single red cent for a new hospital bed. It seems you have no plan for that either. And I just hope the expanded free GP care doesn't go the same way, because a lot of people have heard it today and a lot of people are hoping that they will get that support. A situation of rising expectations but falling standards. Workforce planning in our healthcare system is key and has too often been neglected. We would tackle the issue of capacity, and we recently published a very substantial document which sets out a roadmap that would help us bring us from the current situation of long waiting lists to quicker turnaround times, from poor system capacity and an overworked, underappreciated workforce to a properly functioning system, where healthcare workers are given the dignity, the respect and pride of place they deserve. Childcare is nominally supported by every party in this House, but in effect, the parties on the government bench have not shown us any intention of getting there. We need an Irish National Health Service. We need to end the two-tier system. We need healthcare just as we need housing as basic human rights. And I'd like to address the other key issue of our day, and both of you mention it: climate. I honestly have to say I just find it so funny when people say that we are weak on climate, and that is weak criticism when it comes from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Governments who have presided over one of the worst performing countries in terms of meeting emissions reduction targets. Targets are missed. We don't appear to be making much progress, and your big solution, the carbon tax, has done nothing to change behaviour, because, as we told you countless times, and as somebody who represents a rural constituency, tax can only change behaviour when there is an affordable alternative which someone can change to. So don't cut the bus services. Think about this for a second. The plan was to increase the price of carbon, thinking that everyone would run out and buy expensive electrical vehicles. Well, the energy crisis has pushed the price of carbon far higher than the carbon tax ever did. And I know that the people that come to my clinics, and I am sure the people that come to your clinics, haven't magically been able to afford an electric vehicle, which often start at €40,000. In fact, they can't even afford to retrofit their house. We need a fairer retrofit scheme that will lift people out of energy poverty while reducing emissions at the same time. A lot of families are locked out of the retrofit scheme because they do not meet the criteria for free energy upgrade under the Warmer Home Scheme. Nor do they have the cash reserves to afford a deep retrofit under the one-stop shop scheme. Not only have we provided around 100 million more than you for retrofits, we would completely overhaul the system. We would establish a new retrofit scheme for middle and low-income households with area-based components. If all of our funding was for deep retrofits, it would deliver approximately 6,000 deep retrofits for those who are currently locked out. Under this scheme, households earning up to €75,000 would be entitled to different levels of funding, from between 100% right down to 60% of the cost of deep retrofits, depending on household income. Our second new retrofit scheme would be for solid fuel households. We know that 10% of households rely on solid fuels, mainly in our rural areas, and they tend to be the poorest, coldest and most carbon-intensive homes. We need a targeted scheme for these families. Our final scheme would be based on tiered retrofit support for higher income households. This would reform the current one-stop shop scheme, which provides the same level of funding for deep retrofits irrespective of means. Under our reform scheme, we will provide different levels of support ranging from 55% right down to 5%, with a cap on incomes over 130,000. We believe that if we want to protect against fuel poverty, if we want to improve the energy efficiency of our housing stock, and if we want to make serious inroads in our climate targets, these schemes are necessary, because as it currently stands, many households need to have €25,000 in cash before such a thing can even be considered, and this locks many middle and low-income families out of the equation. Our budget has also made significant provisions for accelerating the transition to renewable energy, and this is through investment and proper resourcing of the planning system to speed up the development of offshore wind generation. And we've heard plenty of times before that Ireland can become a leader in wind energy. We would like to see this dream realised. We too would provide for solar panels for schools, and we have the legislation ready to go to alleviate the planning issues, so you can just talk to my colleagues Darren O'Rourke and Donogh O'Lear on that one. We know that families also want the opportunity to put solar panels on their roofs, and we all hear it from our own estates, and we would provide grants for that. Unlike the government's approach, which provides the same level of grant for all households, our scheme would provide different levels of funding ranging from 100% to 10%, again depending on household income, thereby improving affordability for solar PV for those who would benefit the most from lower bills. We need to make public transport affordable and more accessible if we are serious about driving down emissions. And that actually does include people in rural Ireland. They need sustainable transport options like rural bus services and rail, such as the Western Rail Corridor. And maybe it's not Elon Musk driving a Tesla, but it's what rural Ireland badly needs. We would also like to see serious polluters, like private jets, pay a €3,000 pollution levy per departure. Look, we need to be ambitious in our climate targets, and we need to deliver on them. And Sinn Féin are proposing climate action measures that both improve people's lives and also reduce carbon emissions. Ari, the times are changing. The peoples gathered in their thousands last weekend to say that enough is enough. They can see a better and brighter future ahead. But people will again gather in their thousands this weekend to reimagine the Ireland in which we live, to consider a new Ireland that will put citizens at the centre of decision-making, a united Ireland. Ari, I told you this time last year that the conversations on a new Ireland had already begun, that they were happening in all parts of our communities, and that they were only gaining momentum. Well, Ministers, I'll tell you again, the people are in front of you on this issue, on the issue of the constitutional future of this island. While you dither and delay, the people are leading out in front. You have the opportunity to bring this forward. You can decisively set out the next steps on the road to an Irish unity referendum. Unity is the big idea of our time. There is going to be a unity referendum. There is no if, the only question is when. And you should join us in the conversation. You should make space for everyone to be involved. And you should lead out in front by the establishment of a citizens' assembly. Ari Marfuckelsker, we've heard of no country for old men, but this has become no country for young people. We know this because they're actually literally telling us. This is why 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds are considering emigrating. They see a brighter future for themselves in faraway places like Australia and like Canada. And when I look at today's budget, I'm disappointed for our young people. What is in it for them? Your tax proposals will benefit less than a quarter of taxpayers. You are failing to meet your housing delivery targets, and your housing policies are inflationary. The rent credit will be gobbled up by rent increases because you failed to introduce a rent freeze. But for those young people who are watching on today with growing frustration, let me say to you that we hear you. We see that the ministers in front of us have passed their sell-by date. We know that together we can build a far brighter future for all of us, that our society will only truly flourish when you can call this place home. A new republic is waiting to be born, and it is already being imagined, and it gets closer every day. This will be a new republic where equality, fairness, justice and unity aren't just words that government TDs say because their PR advisers think they make for a nice soundbite, but where these words are living, breathing ideals upon a new republic will be built.
Very much.